I used to think something was wrong with me. Not because of what I did, but because of what I didn't let myself feel. I smiled when I was supposed to, dated who I was expected to, and checked every box of the perfect life. But inside, I was falling apart, and I didn't even know why. Until one day, my therapist said something that hit me like lightning: "You're not broken. You're just suppressing who you are." And then, he showed me. In today's story, we're diving into a real and raw journey of a man who had no idea that his entire life was shaped by fear, shame, and secrets. From growing up in a strict household where certain feelings were never even spoken about, to entering relationships just to please others, to battling anxiety and identity crises behind closed doors, this is a story about what happens when you finally stop running from the truth. And here's the twist: this isn't just about discovering who you love. It's about discovering who you are, when everything you've been taught to believe no longer feels true. This video will take you through one man's emotional path from denial to desire, from therapy to awakening, and from confusion to clarity. You'll witness how a single question from a therapist unlocked a lifetime of buried feelings. You'll see what it's really like to live two lives, and how terrifying and beautiful it can be to finally choose the one that's real. Stay with us until the end, because the final chapter isn't just about coming out. It's about coming home to yourself. Welcome to our channel, where we tell human stories that matter. If you believe in truth, growth, and the power of personal transformation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning. The first few sessions with my therapist felt like any ordinary therapy. I spoke about my anxiety, the weight I carried daily, the depression that had been lingering for years. I had no idea that in those quiet moments, something else was beginning to unravel. He was calm, always asking questions that felt safe, but slowly, they pushed me to dig deeper into the shadows of my mind. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't ready to confront things that had been buried for so long. But, like peeling back layers of an onion, each question made the next one harder to avoid. One day, he looked at me with those steady eyes and said something I wasn't prepared to hear: "I think you're suppressing something you've been taught to ignore or fear." I laughed it off at first. Suppressing something? I'd been living my life. I was just like everyone else, wasn't I? I had my career, my friends, my relationships. What more was there to uncover? But he was right. Something inside me had been locked away for years, and it wasn't just the surface-level issues we'd been talking about. This was deeper. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had been living a lie I'd convinced myself was the truth. I was raised in a world where certain things just weren't discussed. Growing up in a conservative environment, conversations about sexuality were as forbidden as talking about religion at the dinner table. My parents were well-intentioned, but their beliefs created a space where I couldn't question who I was supposed to be. It was easier to just accept the version of me they'd painted: straight, happy, normal. And for years, that's exactly what I tried to be. I'd been in several relationships with women. They were great, in their own way. I enjoyed being with them, but there was always something missing. It wasn't that I didn't care for them, no, it was something more subtle, more suffocating. I felt like I was playing a part in a script that didn't belong to me. I didn't know what to call it at the time, but I knew that something inside me was crying out to be heard. As we sat together in that session, I started to remember moments from my childhood and adolescence, where I had felt a certain attraction, a longing, that didn't align with the normal path I'd been taught to follow. I remembered the secret glances, the feelings I tried to ignore, and the guilt that would wash over me when those thoughts emerged. My therapist didn't push me to acknowledge it right away. He was patient, allowing me the time to think it over. But every session became more intense. He gently nudged me to recognize the suppressed desires I'd buried, convincing me that I wasn't broken for having them. That I wasn't wrong for feeling something that didn't fit the mold I'd spent my whole life building. The hardest part wasn't acknowledging what I felt, it was confronting the shame attached to it. It was understanding that these feelings weren't a sin or a flaw, but a part of who I truly was. That was the moment it hit me: I had spent my life not living, but surviving. I spent days turning over what had been said in that session. I began to recognize the patterns in my life: the avoidance, the lies, the constant pushing down of my own desires. Every time I tried to fit into a life that wasn't mine, I felt like I was losing pieces of myself. And now, sitting in front of a therapist who was kind but unyielding in his approach, I realized that the only way out was through acknowledging the truth I had been hiding from for so long. But it wasn't easy. The fear of what I might discover, the terror of losing everything I thought I knew about myself, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to jump, but unsure of what awaited me on the other side. That session, in particular, stayed with me. For the first time in years, I began to understand that my struggle wasn't just a mental health issue. It was an identity crisis, a crisis I hadn't even known I was in. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I fully understood how deep this issue ran. My therapist had unlocked a door I wasn't sure I was ready to open. But now that it was open, there was no turning back. The days following that session were a blur of emotions, fear, relief, confusion, and a strange sense of excitement. I had always believed that living authentically was something other people could do, but not me. I had convinced myself that who I was, who I'd been raised to be, was the only version of myself that was acceptable. But now, everything felt different. Every day, I faced a new challenge, reconciling the version of me I had been pretending to be with the person I was beginning to understand. I had always felt like an imposter, but now, the mask I had worn for so long was slipping, and I was terrified of what might happen if the world saw me without it. I began to ask myself questions I had never dared to think before. What if I wasn't just living a lie in my relationships but in everything? What if everything I thought I knew about myself had been built on false foundations? One thing became clear: I couldn't keep pretending. The weight of denial was too heavy. The longer I lived this lie, the more I felt like I was suffocating under it. But at the same time, there was this voice in my head, an undeniable pull toward the truth I had been denying for so long. I started to open up to my therapist about the confusion I was feeling. I didn't know what to expect, whether he would think I was crazy, or worse, whether he'd suggest I was just going through a phase. But he didn't. Instead, he guided me through my thoughts, helping me understand that what I was going through wasn't just about being gay or straight, it was about knowing who I was, free from society's expectations and restrictions. It wasn't easy to face the fact that I had spent most of my life repressing these feelings. But as the days passed, I realized something crucial. The fear I was feeling wasn't about being gay, it was about being me. The fear was about stepping into a new identity, a new way of being that I didn't know how to navigate. There were moments when I felt like I was unraveling completely. One evening, I looked in the mirror and wondered who I was looking at. The man staring back at me seemed like a stranger, a man who had been living someone else's life for so long that he had forgotten his own name. But that feeling, as disorienting as it was also the beginning of something important, the opportunity to discover who I truly was. I began to experiment with new ideas, new ways of thinking. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to daydream about a life where I didn't have to hide anything. A life where I didn't have to check the boxes or play the part. It was terrifying, but it was also liberating. But there was one thing I hadn't anticipated: how painful it would be to admit to myself that I had been living someone else's life for so long. The shame I had carried for years started to bubble to the surface. I had been taught to believe that what I felt was wrong, unnatural, and sinful. Those beliefs were so deeply ingrained in me that, even now, they seemed like truths I couldn't escape. But slowly, with my therapist's guidance, I began to replace those old beliefs with new ones. I learned that shame wasn't a reflection of who I was, but rather, a reflection of the world's limited understanding of who I could be. As I let go of those feelings of shame, I began to feel the first sparks of self-love, something I had never really experienced before. I realized something crucial: it wasn't the world that needed to change, it was me. It was about learning to accept the person I had been hiding, the person I had spent years ignoring, and the person who had always been worthy of love and happiness, no matter who he loved. But there was still a lingering question: what now? How would I face the people who had always known me as the man I wasn't? The man they thought they knew. The fear of rejection, of disappointing my family, my friends, and even myself, was overwhelming. I wanted to step forward, to be free, but I didn't know how to take the first step. It was then that my therapist posed another question: what if you didn't have to do it all at once? What if you could take it one step at a time? That's when I realized that coming to terms with who I really was, didn't have to be a grand revelation. It could start small, with me, and the people who truly mattered would understand. It would be a journey, and I didn't have to have all the answers right away. I began to let go of the pressure to have everything figured out. The only thing that mattered was that I was finally starting to figure it out for myself. But I knew there was still a long road ahead, filled with challenges, confusion, and plenty of bumps along the way. Yet, for the first time, I wasn't afraid to walk it. The more I opened up to my therapist, the more complicated things became. It wasn't just about my identity anymore, it was about the emotional landscape I was navigating. I had learned to accept that I wasn't suppressing just one part of myself, but an entire spectrum of feelings that had been buried for years. But what I hadn't prepared for was what would happen when those feelings began to surface in unexpected ways. It started slowly, small moments where I found myself drawn to my therapist in a way that felt more than just professional. At first, I ignored it. I convinced myself it was just the intimacy of therapy, the way he understood me when no one else did. But as time passed, I realized it was more than that. There was something in the way he looked at me, something in the way he listened so carefully, that made my heart race. And for the first time in a long time, I was terrified, not of being myself, but of what I was feeling. I didn't want to believe it. My therapist was the one person I trusted, the one person who had helped me peel back the layers of my repressed self. But now, I was starting to develop feelings for him. I wasn't sure if they were romantic or just a deep sense of attachment, but I couldn't deny that something was shifting inside me. I tried to ignore it. After all, this wasn't supposed to happen. Therapists were professionals, and I was just a client seeking help. But the more I tried to push these feelings away, the stronger they became. I started to dread the end of every session because I didn't want to leave. I started to look forward to our sessions in ways I hadn't before. The guilt was overwhelming. I had been taught all my life that feelings like these were wrong. That there were strict boundaries in relationships, and I was overstepping them. My therapist was there to help me, not to be the object of my feelings. But no matter how much I tried to bury it, the feelings only grew. I couldn't ignore it anymore. One day, during a session, I blurted out something I hadn't planned to say. "I think I'm developing feelings for you." The words hung in the air, and I immediately regretted saying them. I braced myself for rejection, for him to shut me down, or worse, to end our sessions altogether. But he didn't. He looked at me with those steady eyes, the same way he always did, and he didn't flinch. He didn't react with judgment or surprise. Instead, he said something that I'll never forget: "It's okay to feel what you're feeling. But we need to explore why you feel this way." And with those words, everything shifted. For the first time, I wasn't just a patient with a problem to solve. I was a person with real, human emotions, and those emotions were valid, even if they were complicated and messy. We talked through the feelings I had. My therapist was gentle but clear, never encouraging or discouraging me, but instead helping me understand why I was feeling the way I was. He pointed out that sometimes, in therapy, clients develop a deep emotional connection with their therapists. It wasn't uncommon, he explained. That connection was built on trust, vulnerability, and the feeling of being truly seen by someone. It didn't mean I was in love with him, but it did mean that I was learning how to connect with someone on a level one had never allowed myself to before. At that moment, I realized something important: I wasn't in love with him. What I was feeling was something else, a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and the comfort of finally being understood. But in that moment, I also understood how much I had been denying myself the ability to form real, meaningful connections outside of therapy. My therapist wasn't just helping me with my mental health, he was showing me that it was possible to connect deeply with others without fear or shame. Over the next few weeks, I became more and more comfortable in my own skin. I started to see how much I had held back in my life, how much I had avoided intimacy and connection because of the fear of rejection or misunderstanding. My feelings toward my therapist, while complicated, were a sign that I was learning to open myself up, to allow myself to feel and be vulnerable. It was a huge breakthrough. We continued to talk about these feelings in our sessions. He never once judged me or made me feel ashamed. Instead, He helped me navigate the emotional territory I was exploring, helping me understand that this was part of my journey, part of learning to trust myself and others. But even as I made progress, I still struggled with the idea of moving forward. I had acknowledged my feelings and was working through them, but there was still the matter of what came next. I had spent so much of my life in denial, so much of it in a constant state of fear, that now that I was opening up, I wasn't sure how to handle the reality of my emotions. I began to realize that the real challenge wasn't just accepting who I was, it was about learning to trust that my feelings were valid, that my desires didn't need to be hidden anymore. The journey wasn't about fixing myself, it was about accepting myself. And for the first time, I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was worth all of this. As the weeks passed, I began to settle into a rhythm with my therapist. Our sessions became more about exploration than just tackling my anxieties. I wasn't just looking for a quick fix anymore, I was on a journey to understand myself at a deeper level. And with each passing session, I felt as if I was peeling away more layers, uncovering pieces of myself that I had never dared to acknowledge before. Yet, as much as I felt like I was making progress in therapy, I couldn't ignore the overwhelming fear that still clung to me. The fear that once I truly understood who I was, everything in my life would change. I was scared of how my family would react, how my friends would see me, how the world would treat me. I was scared of stepping into an identity that I had spent so long avoiding. But, at the same time, I also began to realize how much of my life had been shaped by fear and shame. It wasn't just about being gay, it was about being me, about living authentically, without pretending to be someone I wasn't. During one particular session, I brought up the topic of coming out. It had been weighing on my mind for weeks. How would I tell the people closest to me? How would they respond? The fear of rejection was paralyzing. But as I spoke about it, I realized that part of me didn't even know how to begin. It wasn't just about talking to others, it was about learning how to talk to myself, to accept the person I was becoming, before I could share it with anyone else. My therapist was gentle but direct. "You don't have to come out all at once," he said. "You can take it step by step. But the most important part is that you give yourself permission to be who you are, even if it means facing difficult conversations along the way." His words stuck with me. The idea that I didn't have to make a grand, dramatic announcement, that I could slowly reveal pieces of myself at my own pace, was both comforting and terrifying. But it also gave me the space to breathe, to accept that I didn't have to have everything figured out at once. The pressure to perform, to live up to everyone's expectations, started to lift. I took small steps in the days that followed. I started by accepting the way I felt about myself, without guilt or shame. I allowed myself to imagine a future where I didn't have to hide. It wasn't easy, but it was freeing in a way I hadn't anticipated. And as I began to embrace my identity, I started to notice something else. I was beginning to see the world in a different light. The things I had once feared, the judgment, the rejection, seemed less important. I realized that the most important thing was not what others thought of me, but what I thought of myself. But even as I made progress, the fear of rejection still lingered. It wasn't until a conversation with my therapist that I began to understand just how deeply that fear had shaped me. He pointed out that I had spent most of my life seeking approval from others, molding myself into what they expected me to be. And in doing so, I had ignored my own needs, my own desires. For the first time, I understood that the rejection I feared wasn't from the world, it was from myself. I had been rejecting myself all along. That realization was both painful and liberating. It was painful because it meant that I had to confront the ways I had been betraying myself. But it was liberating because it meant that I had the power to stop doing it. I could choose to accept myself. I could choose to stop hiding. In the days that followed, I started to make peace with the idea of coming out, not as a single, dramatic moment, but as an ongoing process. I didn't have to tell everyone at once. I didn't have to have it all figured out. I just had to start with the people who mattered most, and trust that they would accept me for who I was. But the hardest conversation was still ahead, the one with my family. I had spent my whole life trying to fit into a mold that wasn't mine. My parents, who had raised me with strict values, would have a hard time understanding. I didn't know how to explain what I had been through, or how to make them see me for who I truly was, without fear or shame. The thought of their disappointment weighed heavily on me. But I also realized that by holding back, I was denying them the chance to love me fully, as I was. I had spent so much of my life trying to make them proud by living up to an image that wasn't mine. What if, instead of hiding who I was, I allowed them to see me as I truly was? Could I be strong enough to let them in? This was the next step in my journey, learning how to face the fear of rejection, not just from others but from the parts of myself I had kept hidden for so long. And as I began to make peace with my truth, I realized that it wasn't about seeking approval from anyone else, it was about seeking acceptance from myself. If I could do that, everything else would fall into place. But that didn't mean the journey was over. There were still so many questions, so many emotions I hadn't fully processed. But I was starting to see that each step, each conversation, was bringing me closer to the man I was meant to be, the man I had always been, but had been too afraid to embrace. And for the first time, I was beginning to believe that it was okay to be him. The final step in this journey wasn't about finding all the answers, it was about learning to live with the uncertainty, the questions, and the parts of myself I had long ignored. After months of therapy, self-reflection, and deep emotional work, I was finally beginning to understand the one thing I had been searching for all along: the ability to be myself, fully and without apology. But as freeing as this new self-awareness was, there were still moments when doubt crept in, when I questioned whether I was truly ready to step out into the world and live authentically. In the weeks after my breakthrough with my therapist, I started to think more seriously about the people in my life, my friends, my family, the people I cared about. The more I thought about coming out to them, the more I realized how much I had hidden, not just from the world, but from them as well. The people closest to me had no idea who I truly was, and that realization weighed heavily on my heart. I wasn't afraid of being judged anymore. What I feared was that they wouldn't understand, that they might feel betrayed by my silence. I had spent so long playing a role for everyone else, and now, I was learning how to speak my truth. But how would they respond? Would they accept me, or would I lose the people I loved? One day, I decided I couldn't wait anymore. I couldn't keep putting it off. I needed to take the next step, to share my truth with the people who mattered most to me. I decided to start with my closest friends. They were the ones who had supported me through thick and thin, and I realized that if I couldn't be honest with them, I couldn't be honest with myself. It wasn't easy. The words felt like they were stuck in my throat. I knew this conversation would change everything, but I didn't know how. I took a deep breath and called them over, asking them to meet me for coffee. As we sat down together, I felt a knot in my stomach, but I knew it was time. Listen, I began, trying to steady my voice, there's something I need to tell you guys. Something I've been keeping from you. And I've been struggling with it for a long time. I paused, the weight of the moment settling on me. I've spent so much of my life pretending to be something I'm not. I've been hiding who I really am. And the truth is, I'm gay. I've always been. For a moment, there was silence. My heart raced, my palms sweating, waiting for their reaction. Would they be shocked? Would they reject me? But then, one of my friends reached across the table and took my hand, a soft smile spreading across her face. I don't care who you love, she said simply. You're still you. We've always loved you for who you are, not who you pretend to be. Tears welled up in my eyes. For the first time, I felt seen for who I truly was, not for the mask I had worn for so long. Their acceptance, their love, was all I needed to hear. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. In that moment, I knew I had taken the most important step toward self-acceptance. But the conversation with my friends was only the beginning. Now came the hardest part, telling my family. I knew my parents, especially, would have a harder time understanding. They had raised me in a world where love was defined by rigid, traditional roles. The idea of me being gay was something they had never expected, never even considered. But I also knew I couldn't keep living this double life, torn between who I was and who they thought I should be. It wasn't fair to them, and it certainly wasn't fair to me. I spent days thinking about how to start the conversation, how to approach it in a way that wouldn't cause them too much pain. I wasn't sure how they would react, and that terrified me. But I also realized that the longer I waited, the more I would be holding myself back. I wasn't just coming out to them, I was also coming out to myself. The night I decided to speak to my parents, my heart felt heavy with the weight of the moment. I sat them down in the living room, my nerves on edge. My mom and dad sat across from me, their faces filled with curiosity, unaware of the storm that was brewing inside me. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something," I started, my voice shaking slightly. "This is hard for me, but I can't keep hiding it anymore. I've been pretending for a long time, and I've been afraid to tell you the truth. But I'm ready to tell you who I really am. I'm gay." There was a long pause, and I braced myself for their response. My mother looked at me, her face a mixture of confusion and concern, while my father stared at the ground. I could feel the weight of their silence pressing down on me, and I fought to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. Finally, my dad spoke. "I don't understand this," he said quietly. "This isn't what we expected. But you're still our son, and we still love you." His words were far from what I had hoped for, but they were enough to help me breathe a little easier. I wasn't sure if my parents fully understood or accepted who I was, but they had taken the first step in showing me that they loved me no matter what. And that, in itself, was a victory. Over the next few weeks, I continued to have conversations with my family. It wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. With each conversation, I felt more and more liberated from the fear that had kept me in the shadows for so long. I wasn't just coming out to others, I was coming out to myself, accepting the man I had always been and the life I wanted to live. As the dust settled, I realized that the true essence of my journey wasn't about finding acceptance from others, it was about accepting myself. I had spent so long hiding, so long pretending, that I had forgotten the most important part of all, loving myself for who I truly was. In the end, the most powerful lesson I learned was this: I didn't need to suppress my desires. I didn't need to hide. I didn't need to live for anyone else's approval. The only person I needed to please was myself. And once I understood that, everything else fell into place. I was finally free. As I look back on this journey, I realize just how much I've grown and how far I've come. It wasn't an easy path, and there were moments when I doubted myself, when I was afraid of the consequences of living authentically. But through therapy, through the support of my friends and family, and most importantly, through embracing who I truly am, I've learned that the most powerful thing I can do is live my truth. This journey wasn't just about accepting my sexuality, it was about accepting myself as a whole, understanding that I am worthy of love, happiness, and self-expression, no matter how messy or complicated that might look. I learned that it's okay to take small steps and that it's okay to not have everything figured out. What matters most is that we are kind to ourselves as we navigate the uncertainties of life. If you're on a similar journey or facing your own fears about coming out, I want you to know that you're not alone. It's okay to take your time, to figure things out in your own way. It's okay to be afraid, but it's also okay to be proud of who you are, no matter what anyone else thinks. If you found this story relatable or helpful, I'd love for you to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of self-discovery, growth, and embracing the truth about who we are. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, you are loved, you are worthy, and you are enough, just as you are. Keep going, and keep being true to yourself.